All right, today we're going to talk about how do we support our missionaries. In the previous video, we talked about what exactly is a missionary, right? It's someone who goes from one culture to another culture to present the gospel or to help out in different ministries such as that. Now, with that in mind, sometimes this involves someone leaving their home country and going to a different country. Well, that can be very difficult for them because in some places they can't get work visas or anything like that. So how exactly do they stay supported? Well, that goes back to their sending country, right? The country that they're from. Usually they'll raise support from churches there so that while they're in the mission field, while they're in this other country, the churches back home are helping support them. Now, different denominations will do this a little differently, but I'm going to kind of talk to you guys about a little bit of a church model and you may come from a different church. For example, if you're from a Catholic church, you definitely don't have the congregational model. Different churches like that, they have a hierarchical model where basically the Pope makes decisions or the bishops make decisions or the cardinals make decisions, but basically the local church doesn't make as many decisions. But with the congregational model, that basically means that the congregation, the local church, decides what's going to happen for the local church. So for example, if a local church, if their pastor dies or something like that, and they need a new pastor, well, they're not going to write to a cardinal or to a bishop or anything like that to ask for another pastor. They're going to go looking for another pastor themselves. They're going to look at resumes, things like that, and the church itself is going to make decisions for who is going to be their new pastor. The same thing with deacons and things like that. Why do Baptists, for example, so Baptists are very congregational. Why do Baptists generally do it this way? Why do they have the church make the decisions? Well, we know that in the New Testament, when they were making decisions for who was going to be the deacons, it was up to the church to make that decision. And with that in mind, we can also see almost every single letter that was ever written, except for Titus and Timothy and stuff like that, they were generally written to the church, not necessarily the pastor of the church. So it seems as though the writers of those letters, generally Paul and Peter and stuff like that, they would write to churches in the hope of helping the church make decisions, because it seemed as though they had a congregational model. For example, when Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, there was a little bit of church discipline that needed to happen. Someone was doing something very immoral, and Paul doesn't say to this church, hey, your pastor should have done something about this, or hey, this person should have done something. It says you as a congregation, it says the church should have done something about this. So as such, we tend to have more of a congregational model where the church, the local church, makes decisions for itself rather than asking a pope or a bishop or a cardinal or something like that to make decisions for them. Now, with that in mind, we also apply that same logic to missionaries. So for example, you may have never met a missionary. I know in the Southern Baptist, our previous missionary director he used to be a pastor from a Southern Baptist, and he said missionaries almost never came to their churches. And the reason for that was because the Southern Baptists, if I remember correctly, they'll ask the churches to raise support for the missionaries, but they'll just say, hey, send the money to this group. So the Southern Baptist churches under that umbrella, they'll send the money to that group, and that group will decide what missionaries are supported. So the missionaries will basically just go to that group, as far as I know, and they'll try and raise support that way. They won't necessarily go to the churches. But with the independent Baptist churches, we kind of emphasize the congregational model a little more than probably the Southern Baptists, and as such, we'll ask the missionaries to actually come to our church specifically, because as a church, we're going to decide what missionaries we're going to support. And we don't do that fully. So for example, if I was going to be a missionary, and I said, you know what, I want to be a missionary, so I go to my local church and I say, hey, I want to be a missionary. Will you guys support me? And they may say, yes, we'll support you. And they may support me for several $100s a month, but I can't go to another country off of a few $100s a month, not very easily. So with that in mind, I'm going to need more support, because no church, generally speaking, in independent Baptist churches, we don't fully support a missionary. We generally divide the support by dozens of different churches, and I'll tell you why we do that. So basically, if there's dozens of different churches maybe supporting a church at maybe $100 a month or $50 a month, whatever it might be, if they're doing that for every single missionary, and let's say a missionary has 50 different churches supporting them, 50 at $100 a month, well, that can be quite a bit. So they're going to another country knowing that 50 different churches are supporting them at $100 a month, and that can be very secure for them. Just as if you were trying to invest, you kind of want to divide your investment so that if one stock gets hurt, the other stock, that you won't completely go under. So in much the same way, when we support missionaries, we do that and we divide it up so that if one church struggles financially and they have to drop support, you've only lost maybe 1/50th of your support, or 1/20th, depending on how many churches you have supporting you. So with that in mind, we generally try and divide it up. If one church struggles and can't support the missionary anymore and they have to drop support, then that missionary can still stay on the field. But let's say it was just one church supporting that missionary, and they were supporting that missionary, let's say at $2,000 a month or something like that. And the missionary, they were struggling to get by in this foreign country at $2,000 a month. But then that church decides it's struggling and they say, sorry, we can't support you anymore. Well, that missionary can't survive in that mission field because they don't have their support anymore, so they'll have to leave. But if that was divided by 20 or 30 or 50 different churches, then that wouldn't be a problem, because if one church struggled and had to drop support, then the missionary would still be okay, things like that. So that's how we do it at the independent Baptist churches. Maybe you're from an independent Baptist church and you do it a little differently. That's fine. But maybe you're from a different denomination and you do it very differently. That's perfectly fine too. The point is that we are trying to send missionaries to fulfill the Great Commission. Jesus said, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. Now, our hometowns, that's part of the world, and we should be preaching the gospel in our hometowns, but God sometimes specifically sends missionaries to other countries, such as Paul, for example. Peter, he was going to be God's witness to the Jewish people, and he was, definitely. But Paul was specifically called to be a missionary. He was specifically called to be a witness to the Gentiles. The Gentiles were a completely different culture, and they lived in different countries than where the Jews lived. So Paul and his companions like Barnabas and Silas and stuff like that, they had to go from country to country bringing the gospel. So we have an obligation to help support our missionaries so that they can go do those things and bring the gospel to the world. That's part of the Great Commission. We should still be witnessing here in our hometown, but we also need to remember that there are people around the world that haven't yet heard the gospel. And we have an obligation, we have a commission to go tell them about the gospel. So let's support our missionaries.